So my name is Tijmen Amsing, and I'm a full-stack web developer at Capgemini. I live in Utrecht together with my girlfriend, and we're currently looking for a new home in Nijmegen. And I've been working for Capgemini since 2016, and I did multiple projects with Angular and .NET Core. And like Finn said, I like to invest time in code quality, and I'm always interested in ways to improve and automate my work. My current project is at the Ministry of Defense. We're creating an Angular app from scratch, and it started out pretty simple, but there are plans to add more and more features to that. So we really have to think about structuring our code and about reusability. And this time we've opted for a monorepo using Annex DevTools. And I thought for this talk it would be interesting to show you how to set up an Annex workspace like we did, and how that benefits code reuse. So my talk will be about how to organize code reuse, and I will do that in the context of Angular monorepos, and I will show you how Annex DevTools can help you with that. But first, why reuse code? Code reuse is about not doing the same thing twice, also known as don't repeat yourself. And with code reuse, you can save time. Initially, it may cost you a bit more time to set it up, but the second time you need it, you'll be happy that you don't have to do it again. With code reuse, you can also have fewer bugs in your code because the reused functionality has been tested before. And if there is a bug, it will be better traceable because you don't have different implementations all over. You can also have a more consistent user experience due to the reused UI components that you have. And you can also simplify maintenance, and making changes will be much easier because you only have to do it in one place as well. So when you talk about Angular, you can implement reusability in various ways, such as components and directives, pipes or services, or even complete features that may be a combination of these. But I'm not going to talk about all of that today. But instead, I'll talk about how you can organize your reusable Angular code. Because when you have a huge code base that many developers work on, you want the developers to understand how to use it, and you want them to follow certain standards in order to maintain that code quality. And out of the box, since Angular 6, all apps and libraries are located in a workspace. So that means that the workspace is a collection of apps and libraries. And how you manage all these files in source control can be achieved in two ways. And option 1 is a multi-repo with a feed, and option 2 is a monorepo. And since this is a heavily discussed subject, I'll start by saying that I'm not going to argue that the one is better than the other. And I think there are valid options for using both. And if there were time today, I would like to show you both. But today I will focus on the monorepo. So let's briefly compare the both. With the multi-repo and a feed, each library is located in its own feed, and all the libraries are published to a feed and installed as dependencies. On the positive side, it's very organized and it's a very flexible approach, but working simultaneously in different repositories can be pretty inefficient. And creating and using a library is time-consuming, because each time you have to create a repo, you have to set up the CI, clone the repo, create the library, commit your changes, then build your library, install this dependency, and then finally you can import it in your code. Whereas with monorepo, all code is located in a single repository. So it's very easy to create and use shared code. All you have to do is create a library, and then you can import it in your code. And another benefit is that you can also commit changes to multiple projects at once. But the downsides are that there's lots of code in the config, lots of code and config in one place, and without the proper tooling, the CI becomes pretty complex. So that brings me to the next slide. So when all your code is in one repository, each commit would normally trigger a full build and test and code quality analysis. So the more projects you add, the longer your CI takes. And after a while, you start thinking why you should rebuild project X when it has zero relation to your change. So then the question is, how can I have confidence in my change while not having to wait hours on a full CI? Or differently put, what if we could only run a CI for the code that is affected by my change? And that's where Annex comes in. Annex is a toolset for managing Angular monorepos. And it comes with several features, but the biggest feature for me is the affected command. And the affected command uses code analysis to only run on code that is affected by the current change. And when you build your workspace using the affected command, it looks at what files are changed, what projects own those changed files, and what projects depend on these projects. It then creates a tree of projects to build, which you can also display in a nice graph. And this will save you a lot of time while maintaining confidence in the quality of your change. But it doesn't stop there. NX also brings computation caching. NX stores the result of your build, the test, and the lint when you run a command, and it determines if it has been tested, if it has been computed before. And if so, it returns the cached result rather than executing it again. It also comes with a CLI that adds more useful commands to the default Angular CLI, such as running commands in parallel. And with NX, you can add lint rules that impose constraints on which projects depend on each other, which may be useful to make sure developers follow conventions. And this brings me to the last thing I want to mention before we go to the demo. NX brings some cool performance features to your monorepo, but what about the code reuse that I talked about earlier? And as we'll see in a demo, it's extremely easy to create and use reusable code in an NX workspace. NX also gives us some guidelines on how to structure all that reusable code, because even in small projects, you get multiple libraries in your workspace. And when the number grows, or even when another developer starts contributing, it's a good practice to have some conventions. And this helps in making your code understandable and better maintainable. And the following is something that NX recommends as well, to make conventions on what type of libraries there are. Each type should have a specific goal. For example, you may come up with a UI library type that may only contain simple presentational components, or a utility library type that may only contain pure utility functions such as sorting, formatting, calculating, and the like. You can also have conventions on scopes and naming of the libraries. And the scope can be anything, but what you often see is that you have libraries that are specific for an app and libraries that are can be shared across multiple apps. So it's a good practice to place libraries in folders according to its scope. And you may want to include the scope and the type of the library in the name of the library. And at last, you can add tags to the libraries to specify that scope and the type. And these tags can then be used to create linting rules to enforce constraints on the dependency types. For example, you may want to prevent utility libraries to depend on UI libraries. And all of this will also come back in my demo. And in my demo, I'd like to show you the following. We'll create a new NX workspace with 2 apps and some reusable libraries. We'll view the dependency graph to understand the workspace structure. We'll use tags and lint rules to constrain the allowed dependencies. And we'll use the affected command to quickly run builds and tests. And at last, we'll review a CI pipeline that I created in Azure DevOps. So I came up with the case we're going to implement. A school wants 2 apps that help students and teachers to create and hand in school assignments. And the students should be able to view the assignments and hand in the assignments. And the teachers should be able to create assignments, review the assignments, review the hand-ins. And the teacher should also be able to manage the students that are in his or her class. And as you can see, both the teachers and the students need to do something with assignments and hand-ins. So I think we have some great opportunities for sharing code there. And as an example, I'd like to show you how to create and use libraries for the assignments. But due to the limited time, we're going to actually create the working apps, but instead we'll focus on setting up the infrastructure that would enable code reuse for these apps. And we'll focus on using the affected command to improve our CI. I've prepared a repository that contains the final result, but I have also set up some branches with intermediate progress so that we can skip the boring stuff. So the steps will be to create a workspace and a teacher app, create some libraries for the assignments, and then implement these libraries for both the teachers and the students. And then we'll fast forward to the final result, which contains the rest of the features, as well as the CI pipeline. So I'm using Windows Terminal, Windows Subsystem for Linux, and I'm using Visual Studio Code. And you can use any tool that you like, but I would recommend VS Code for Angular development. And as a preparation, I've already checked out some branches with intermediate progress in different folders. So let's now start with creating a new workspace. And all you need to do for that is to run the command npx create NX workspace. And then it will interactively go through some options. And the first option is the workspace name or the organization name. And this is a way of namespacing, and the name that you enter here will be used as prefix for all your code imports. So let's say that our workspace name is going to be school. And then it comes with a few options to what we want to create in our workspace. And we go for Angular for now. But note that there are other type of projects that support it. So you can also have Angular and React apps side by side. For the application name, we're going to start with teacher app. So let's use teacher app here. And as a default style sheet format, we'll go for a simple plain CSS. And the last question is whether I want to use NX Cloud. And NX Cloud enables distributed computation cache, which means you could share your computations with your team and your CI, which is pretty neat. But it does cost you a bit of money, although it doesn't say that although it says that it's free here. So what this command will do is create a workspace with one app and install dependencies. But since this will take a few minutes, I've already done this. So let's go to the result of this command. Open Visual Studio Code. Let's have a look at the structure of our folders. So as you can see, we have one apps directory, which contains the teacher app and the end-to-end tests. The teacher app is just an empty shell for the app. The libraries directory is empty. And also an interesting file is the NX.json file, which is the configuration that NX needs for managing the monorepo. And the most interesting part is this projects list, which is a list of all the projects in your workspace and the tags that they have. So for now, we just have the teacher app and the end-to-end teacher app. Also, something interesting is that we only have one package.json in our whole workspace. So all the dependencies that are listed here will be used for all the libraries and apps in your workspace. And this is different from a multi-repo where all projects have their own list of dependencies. So now that we have an empty workspace, let's add some libraries to it. And there are two ways to create libraries, using Visual Studio Code extension or the NX or via the CLI. And like I said, we'll start with some libraries for the assignments, and teachers should be able to create assignments, and both the teachers and the students should be able to view them. And you're completely free in how you want to structure these libraries. But following the NX guidelines, I came up with 3 libraries. I will create one for fetching and posting assignments to some API. And this will be of the data access library type. And one for displaying the assignments, and this will be of the type UI. And one that exposes the related models, and I will use models as library type there. So like I said, there are 2 ways to create a library, and that is the first, I will use the NX console, which is a Visual Studio Code extension. And it gives us some options about the command we want to do, and let's go for generate. And then you can choose that you want to generate an Angular library. And it gives us a lot of options, but there are only a few options that we're going to need for now. And that's the library name, which will be, let's start with UI. So and the directory that we will place this library in is going to be shared, because it's going to be a shared library. We want to use it both in the student and in the teacher app. And besides that, it's going to be placed in a folder that is called assignments, because we're going to have 3 libraries that have to do something with assignments, and I want them all 3 to be located in the shared assignments directory. And the last option that we're going to use is the tags option, So we're going to tag this library with 2 tags, and that is one for the scope, and the scope is going to be shared, and the other tag is going to be the library type, which is going to be UI. And next already there's a driver in that shows us what files it will create. And if you're okay with that, you can click on Run. And it will ask you one more question, which is the style sheet, and we'll go for CSS again. So, and the other 2 libraries, the data access and the models, we'll use the CLI for that. So this is the command for that. We're going to create an Angular library. The name will be data access. The directory will be shared assignments, and the scope will be, the text will be scope shared and data type as data access as type. And we'll do the same for the models library. So let's review what files have been generated for us. As you can see, we've now got a shared assignments directory in our libs directory with 3 libraries in there. The data access, the models, and the UI, and they're just empty libraries that we can add code to. And it also added these projects to the NXJSON file with the scopes that we entered in the CLI or in the Visual Studio Code extension. But with our code, these libraries aren't going to do much. So I've added some code in another branch. So let's go to there. And let's close this. So I've added some code to the libraries. I've created a assignment class in the models, which contains some properties about the assignment. I've created a Angular service in the data access library, which just returns in a dummy assignment right now, but normally this would fetch an assignment from some server. And at last, we created a dummy or a DOM, I should say, component, which has an input parameter for the assignment, and then it will just represent that incoming assignment as HTML. So these are all the parts that we're going to need, but they aren't going to do much, but alone they don't do anything much. So we have to create a library that ties these together, and for that I already created the feature create assignments library. And then what it will do is call the assignment service and fetch the assignment. And it will then pass this assignment to the school assignments component, which is the reusable component that is in the assignments UI library. And this feature library is lazily loaded to the teacher app, as you can see here. And lazy loading is a common way to improve the performance of an app. It's not necessary, but it's a common way to do that. So let's now use the dependency graph provided by INEX to understand our current workspace. So as you can see, we've got one teacher app, and that lazily loads in the teacher feature create assignments library, and it's lazy loaded, so it's a dotted line. And this feature library then imports the 3 assignments libraries. And as you can see, we've got a teacher scope and we've got a shared scope, and within the shared scope, we've got a shared assignments scope. So let's also have a quick look at what the application actually looks right now. And I'm not a designer, so it looks pretty basic. But the important part is actually the graph that tells us what the application looks like. So this is my first assignment, and my first assignment is to watch the build, and the deadline is for today. So this is something that the teacher could see in an application, and maybe he has a button to change that assignment. We can now easily use the same libraries for the assignments, for viewing and assignments in the student app. And for that, I added the student app and a feature library in a similar way as I did for the teachers. And due to the limited time, I've also included the rest of the functionalities to our demo workspace. And my workspace at the master branch contains around 20 projects. So let's move to our master branch, which I have already checked out. And let's again have a look at the NX graph to see what the application looks like. Let's first focus on the assignments. So as you can see, we still got these 3 assignments libraries, and they're still imported in the teacher library, but they're now also included in the student app and the student feature view assignments library. Now let's focus on what else we've got in the student app. Because besides the assignments, I've done something similar for the hand-ins. So we've got a data access, a UI, and a models library there. And I've created some util formatting library, and I've created a UI header library and a UI menu library. And I've also created some dummy things for authentication. And all of these things are in the shared scope, which means they can also be used by the teacher app. So as you can see, this is everything for the teacher app. And as you can see, they're also using the assignments, the authentication part, and the hand-ins, but also the formatting utility library and the menu and the header as well. But different than the student, the teacher also has some libraries specific for the teacher, and that is to administer the class and the students that will be in his class. And this is something that is specific for the teacher, and we don't want the students app to include or import anything that is in the teacher scope. We want to prevent that. So how can we enforce that? And we can do that via tags and lint rules. So let's have a look at that. Let's have a look at the NX.json file. As I said, it contains a list of all the applications and the libraries that are in our workspace. And during the creation of the libraries, I also added tags for their scope and the type of the library. As you can see, all the projects now have a tag to it. And we'll reuse these tags in our lint. Because the cool thing is that we can set up some lint rules that make sure the developers don't start importing teacher-specific libraries to the student app. And you're completely free in what tags and lint rules you want to use. And you could also do without. But let's see our setup. This is a common TS-lint file with some lint rules. But this is something that is specifically for NX workspaces. And it contains a list of dep constraints, which are always a combination of a source tag and tags that may be imported, may be used by the source tag. So, for example, a library that is tagged with a scope student tag may only depend on other libraries of the scope student tag or in the scope shared. But a library that is tagged as a student may never depend on a library that has the scope teacher, because it is not in this array. And something similar applies for this. So this is for the scoping, and something similar applies to the type of the library. For example, you may say that a data access library may never depend on a UI library. Data access should only depend on utility libraries or models libraries. So let's see if all the projects validate with the current set of lint rules. So we're running the target lint for all the projects, and we're going to do that in parallel. And as you can see, it already finished, and that is because of the computation cache NX uses. I've already ran this command before, and because nothing changed in my workspace, NX uses the cached output. So let's now try to add a class admin library to the student app, and this should not be possible because it's specific for the teacher. I'm just going to create to add the models of the class admin to the imports of this app module of the student. So let's quickly have a look at the next graph again to review our change. And as you can see, the student app now directly imports the teacher class admin models library. Let's see what our int says about that. And it's not going to use the cached output because something changed. But instead, it's now throwing an error saying that the project tag with the scope student can only depend on libraries with the scope student or with scope shared. So these are exactly the tags that we entered in the tslint file. And because our class admin models module is in the teacher scope, it is not allowed to import this in the student app. You would get the same result for any other invalid dependency according to your lint rules. So I think that was a very cool thing when I saw this for the first time. So I've now covered what I wanted to cover about reusing code in an NX workspace. And as a result, we have a workspace of around 20 projects. But they are all very small, actually unrealistically small, with each containing only a few files and a few tests. And are ready to do a full build, test, and lint of all the projects takes our build agent around 3.5 minutes. And adding more and more to this workspace will, of course, only increase that time. So let's use the remaining time to have a look at the affected command of NX and how it helps us to reduce this time. Let's say we want to introduce a new formatting function in our existing formatting utility library. We're going to check out a new branch for that. And for the sake of the demo, we'll just create some random class in the shared util formatting project. And I will name that class my new formatter. And we can use a combination of the affected command with the dev graph to review what NX thinks what projects have been affected by this change. So what NX does is it see in what projects the change has been made, which is in the shared util formatting library. And then it sees what projects directly depend on this library, which is the Handins UI library and the student app. And then it goes up in the tree to search for indirect dependencies, which is everything else. NX marks everything that is affected in red, but as you can see, it's only a small fraction of our complete workspace. And to have confidence in this change, we only need to run the CI for the projects that are in red. because all the other projects aren't affected by our change. And that's exactly what I've told NX to do in my Azure pipeline. So I've created two pipelines, one using affected and one that always runs for every project, which would occur when not using NX. And this pipeline, which is called Slowpoke, uses the run many command, and it targets lint, test, and build. And it does that for all projects. So nothing fancy here. And the other pipeline uses the affected command for linting, testing, and building. And it sets our master branch as a base for what it should compare our changes to. And lastly, it runs the command for each project in parallel, which also is an option that NX provides out of the box. And I've already let the pipelines run for the change we just did, which was adding the file to a formatting library. So let's review the difference in time for both pipelines. So the Slowpoke job took about 4 minutes to complete. And that is including installing the dependencies, npm install. But as you can see in the lint task, it does lint for all the projects in our workspace. And it does the same for test and the same for the build. And the build is only ran for applications, but it runs for both of the applications. And it took about 3.5 minutes to do the lint, the test, and the build. So now let's go to the other pipeline, which uses affected. And as you can see, it took 2 minutes. And it lints and builds and tests only the projects that were in red, so only the projects that are affected by this change, which are 8 projects. And the combination of these commands took about 1.5 minutes. So in conclusion, the pipeline using the NX command is already twice as fast, and that will only increase the more code that you have in your workspace. And with that, I would like to end my presentation.
Thank you. Great presentation. Yeah, we have 2 questions for you, and I have one myself, but let's start with the question from Martijn de Graaf. He asks his question is when a project grows, is it common to go from mono to multi repos? And are there any guidelines for that?
Well, Google uses monorepo and Microsoft uses monorepo, and they have lots of code. So I don't think it's an option to say how big your project is, because I think the monorepo can be used for big and small projects. So it's really depends on what your team likes in the end, I guess.
Okay. So is it a best practice then to use monorepos over multi-repos?
Well, that's like I said in my presentation, that's a heavily discussed subject. I like to do it this way for the current project that I have, but I've also worked with the multi-repo setup, and I also like that as well. So it's not a bad practice to choose either one. But if you do choose for a monorepo and you're using Angular, I would certainly recommend to use NX, because without NX, it's pretty difficult to manage the monorepo and to manage your CI as well.
Okay. So there's one more question. Rutix asks if this means that all projects always have to use the latest version of a library.
Not certainly the latest version of a library. If I guess he's targeting that there's only one package JSON in your workspace, which lists all the third-party dependencies. And yes, all your libraries and all your apps use the same third-party dependencies, but of course it doesn't doesn't have to be the latest version of Angular that you depend on. It may also be Angular 6 or 7 for whatever you want to use. But yeah, all the projects use that same version of Angular if you're depending on that version.
Okay, okay. I can imagine that this is completely new for people that are watching. Do you also have some tips on documentation besides your GitHub repo that they can check, but also some more documentation for starting?
Yeah, well, there is the NX Dev website, of course, which contains a lot of examples and documentation. And they also wrote a book about this, which
Okay.
isn't 100, which is about 50 pages, I guess. It's not that big, but it does contain some of the guidelines that they have. Yeah.
Okay, nice. And is that something that you can download from that website as well?
I downloaded. I guess you have to subscribe or enter your email address, and then we'll send it to your email. But yes,
Okay.
it's free. Yeah.
Nice. Good starting point then.